Today, we are going to talk about different aspects of genetics that influence addiction, whether it be to drugs or alcohol. Epidemiological studies results have shown that genetic components influence all steps of addiction, which includes vulnerability to initiation, persistent use, and the proneness to become dependent. To boil down all the components of addiction, it is a combination of genetic predisposition to addiction, environmental factors, and neurological changes due to long-term exposure to the addictive substance. So, what is addiction? Addiction is defined as compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. As just talked about, addiction is influenced by many factors and does not have one root cause. With that, about 50% of the risk for addiction is actually genetic, with the rest being dependent on other factors. Genetics count for 75% of a person's inclination to start smoking, it counts for 60% of the tendency to become addicted, and 54% of one's ability to quit. Now let's talk about the first part of addiction that I mentioned above, genetic predisposition. Genetic predisposition is the increased likelihood of developing a particular disease due to the presence of one or more gene mutations and/or a family history that indicates an increased risk of the disease. Some people carry genes that predispose them to alcoholism, substance abuse, and other addictions, although they may not have problems if they choose to avoid alcohol, drugs, or etc. Many large twin studies for alcohol addictions have persistently shown that the heritability of alcohol abuse and dependence ranges from 50 to 70%. The top examples of heritable genes that influence addiction are genes encoding inactive enzymes for alcohol and aldehyde metabolism. These alleles make consuming ethanol used in alcohol very unpleasant. The outcome is more known as hangovers. And because of the distasteful effect, the alleles are considered to be protective against alcohol abuse. In this figure, it shows the process of how alcohol dehydrogenase, or ADH, and aldehyde dehydrogenase, ALDH, metabolizes ethanol. The first enzyme, ADH, oxidizes ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is further oxidized by ALDH, forming acetic acid. The acetic acid then can be turned into acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA, which goes to the Krebs cycle to release stored chemical energy for ATP production, or uses fatty acid production pathways to synthesize fats for later use. Acetaldehyde buildups accounts for unpleasant feelings of hangovers, therefore people born with low levels of ALDH find consuming ethanol unpleasant. The next part of addiction that I'm going to talk about is the environmental factors that also come into play with the risk of addiction. Although genes make one vulnerable to specific environmental insults, don't mean one is predestined to become an addict. Therefore, there is a very big importance in one's early adolescent years as influences start early on. Consider this. 90% of people who will become smokers start smoking before 18, and only 10% will become smokers if they start after 18. Using illicit drugs before 18 causes a 25% chance of becoming addicted, and after 21, only a 4% chance of becoming addicted. Therefore, adolescence is a crucial time for the development of addiction. Long-term studies in several countries suggest as early as kindergarten and elementary school is when you can start distinguishing children who are more likely to abuse alcohol in adolescence and early childhood. For example, children who are impulsive, exploratory, excitable, curious, distractible, and less cautious have a greater risk of adult alcoholism. Family interactions, peer dynamics, parenting styles, and supervision play a pivotal part during growing up years for the development of later substance use. When you are young, we develop coping mechanisms with stress, and when these strategies are maladaptive, they can lead to risky self-destruct behaviors. Lastly, there are neurological changes that happen once a person is addicted to certain substances. Let's start with the basics, understanding the networking of neurons and the importance of their workings in the brain while being dependent on illicit drugs. First, synapses. Synapses are tiny spaces between neurons where the fibers of one cell or sender connect to the fibers of another cell, which is the receiver. Synaptic pathways are a train of neurons connected by synapses affecting the next in line. With that, each cell that fires each other end up being more strongly connected just as repetition strengthens and perpetuates learning. Once an addiction to a drug is in play, each time causes more synapses to be changed or reinforces their firing configuration or pattern, which connects to all regions all over your brain. With that, new habits are forming where synapses connect certain neurons to other neurons, forming and strengthening some networks while other networks shut down with disuse. With each craving comes more power, as the brain becomes more accustomed to the substance use. To get your goal, the nucleus accumbens, which is the part of the brain you hear the most when it comes to addiction, organizes neural activity in the frontal cortex, back of the cortex, the amygdala, promoter, and motor cortex. With these parts, the power of the accumbens is to control attention, perception, feeling, and action. It is also considered as the brain region where desire is created. The dopamine pathway. The accumbens draws dopamine up from the midbrain to fuel its goal-seeking impulses and sends signals back to the midbrain, which changes pathways to carry dopamine. Over time, the midbrain sends dopamine to more northern parts of the ventral striatum, which includes the accumbens, which then signals the midbrain to send dopamine further north and eventually as far north as the dorsal striatum. The dorsal striatum converts the sent dopamine into a behavioral command which explains the acts of compulsion within a person with an addiction. To wrap up, it is evident that the genetic basis for addiction is complex, including the environmental factors and neurological changes. Much still remains to be discovered about genetic changes and influences on one's susceptibility to addiction. While we await for the advancements of new drugs to help individuals off their addictions, it is important to recognize and provide for the non-genetic aspects for struggling individuals and their families.